Similar to the state commands, the waitFor commands detect the state of an element. Depending on those results, they will pause the script execution until the desired state is met. This sort of functionality is extremely useful when testing a page that has animation-based delays or functionality that requires an indeterminate amount of time to execute. Instead of using an arbitrary time delay, which always runs the risk of being too short, we can use the waitFor commands to hold off just long enough before continuing with our test. The basic format of all of the commands is a state to wait for, what element to check the state of, and how long to wait for that state. There is a third argument to the commands that we'll take a look at later. Before that, though, we're going to take a look at how we can take advantage of the state commands to write more robust tests for our robot website. In this example, we'll be testing the robot checkout flow, adding a product with a quantity to our cart, clicking the Buy Now button, then validating and closing the thank you message that's returned. To start things off, we'll need to create the skeleton for our test. In a new file titled cart.js, we'll open up a describe block talking about our cart functionality. Since we'll be testing the checkout page, we need a before each function to navigate to that page for each of our tests. We do this for every test, so we have a clean page to test on each time. Our first test will be validating that we can only click the Buy Now button after we've entered a quantity. First, we'll use our isEnabled state command from the previous lesson to validate that the Buy Now button is disabled to begin with. Normally, we don't need to validate the beginning state of our test, but here it's a good idea since the default for a button is for it to be enabled. After our initial validation, we'll use the setValue command to enter a quantity into the corresponding input field. With a quantity entered, the Buy Now button should now be enabled. We'll use the same isEnabled state command to check it, this time expecting the return value to be true instead of false. That's it for the first test. We validate some basic functionality of the shopping cart. Now it's time to dive into the checkout process. We'll create a nested describe statement to help section this portion of the test apart from the rest. There are a couple commands in common we're going to run for each of these checkout tests. Since the commands are all the same, we can add them to a second before each function. Note that this before each function only runs for tests inside the checkout process describe block. This is a Mocha pattern that's very useful with our test hierarchy. Inside the before each function, we're going to set the quantity to 10, just like we did in the previous test. Notice that we're not asserting the state of the Buy Now button. It would be redundant to test this again, so we can happily ignore it. Next, we'll click the Buy Now button, initiating the cart checkout process. Since we're using the same elements, we're referring to the same CSS selector again and again. To make this easier to read and more maintainable, I'm going to move these selectors up to a common JavaScript variable, replacing our existing usage with it. With this administrative code out of the way, let's start in on our next test. We'll be checking that the Buy Now button becomes disabled while we wait for the response from our Buy Now action. We don't want the user submitting 2 orders, even if that would provide a short-term increase in sales. Similar to our first test, we'll validate the enabled state of the button. We're checking that it's disabled, as we just clicked the button and haven't received a response from the checkout server yet. We'll also validate that the text changed inside the button from Buy Now to Purchasing. That's all we're looking at in this test. We simply want to ensure that the state changes from pre-buy to pending. If you didn't fall asleep in the previous video, then this should all look familiar so far. If you did fall asleep, well, I can't blame you as I'm a parent of young kids and then I am liable to doze off whenever I can. But now we're going to dive into the waitFor commands, so if you need a dose of caffeine to make it through, press pause and go pour yourself a cup. In our functionality, we submit an order to a checkout cart server, which processes the information and returns a result. Since this is a demo page, the result always returns within 2 seconds and is always successful. That's not always the case though. It could easily take 10 seconds to resolve the status, even though the sales team would cringe at that delay. Regardless, the truth is that we just don't know how long it will take. This is where our waitFor commands come in handy. Instead of requiring a long delay in our tests just to make sure we give the server enough time to respond, we use the waitFor commands to wait just long enough for the response to come back, No more, no less. In the next test, we'll be using the waitFor exist command to delay our test until the success message element exists. As I mentioned before, the command takes the selector of the element you're waiting for. It also optionally takes a timeout limit, which by default is 500 milliseconds. If the wait reaches that limit, the test will error out. If we need a longer delay, we can increase this timeout by passing in the number of milliseconds to wait as a numeric value. As soon as the element is found, the remainder of the test proceeds. The timeout is only used as an upper limit for how long to wait. If the element is found immediately, the test will immediately continue. Using waitFor exist, we're going to verify that the thank you message appeared and that it includes the quantity we entered for the product along with its name. The first thing we'll do is define the selector we're going to use to match the element we're looking for. Here we're defining a partial text match selector, telling Selenium to look for an element that has a class of callout and contains the text with the words, "Thank you, human." Next, we'll use our waitFor exist command to pause execution of the script until the thank you text is found. We'll increase the timeout to 3000 milliseconds, or 3 seconds, to ensure we wait long enough for the response to return. Once found, we'll get the complete text of the thank you message and pass that into our expect function, checking that it contains our desired quantity and product. Sometimes we don't need to check whether an element exists, but rather wait for it to be in a certain state. In the next example, we'll be using the waitFor value command to check that an input's value is a specific number before continuing on. This command works just like waitFor exist, but I'm going to use it in a slightly different way. Instead of waiting for a value to appear, I'm going to wait for it to disappear. To do this, I'll use the reverse flag at the end of my command call to tell WebdriverIO to wait until the value no longer exists in the input. For this test, we'll be finding out if the quantity input is cleared after the checkout is completed. It's a very basic test, simply waiting for the value in quantity to disappear. We don't need an assertion, as waitForValue is acting in that role. Remember that we're using the true flag as the last parameter in our command to wait for the value to be gone, instead of waiting for it to have a value. This last test is going to be a little tricky. It will use two waitFor commands. First, waitFor exist to check that the success message has been shown. Second, waitFor visible, because the message animates away on click, taking half a second or so to disappear. The only thing this test is really checking is that the thank you message is gone after clicking the close button, so we'll name it accordingly. Next, we'll select the message using a partial text selector similar to what we did a couple of tests ago. We'll then wait for that message to exist. After it appears, we'll click the close button inside of it. Then we'll use the waitFor visible command, passing in the true flag as the last parameter to make it act more like waitFor invisible. Now our test will pass only after the thank you message is no longer visible on the page. The element will still be there, but it's hidden from sight. With all our tests written up, it's time to make sure they actually work. These tests take a little bit longer to run, as each one has to wait for a specific event to occur. Still, it's better than having to wait 10 seconds for each test because you just need some arbitrary number you know won't fail. Looks like all our tests passed. It took a little longer, but sometimes browser testing does. All the other waitFor commands work in a similar fashion. They take a selector, an optional timeout limit, and an optional reverse flag. They simply check different states. There's one more wait command to go over, but it's special, so we'll show that off in the next video.